Sure, let's talk Meshtastic.
Okay.
Uh,
What is it? The good place to start, because I feel like a lot of people have probably never heard of it.
it is little tiny embedded devices. In fact, I happen to have one here. I printed the case, and inside of this is a little, technically it's called a rack 4631. It's a little embedded development board, but it's got a LoRa radio on it. LoRa stands for long range. In the United States, it's the 915 megahertz band. And so it's all that means is it's a radio. It's an open source radio. It lets you send short text messages from place to place. The mesh part of the name is because it meshes, which means, if I have one of those and you have one of them, and then, Joe Bob down the road has one, I may not be able to send a message from mine to Joe Bob's, but if you're in the middle, your radio will repeat the message so that he's able to get it. It meshes. It does that thing. And it's intended for off-grid communications. It was originally written by a guy that was out, literally he spent time out like hiking and hang gliding with his friends, and they would get out of cell phone service, and they wanted a way to be able to track each other and send text messages back and forth. And so they found the, I think it was originally based on some hardware from a Chinese company called Liligo. They found this is like, it's an ESP32 with a LoRa radio slapped on it. The guy, Kevin is his name, he wrote this firmware for it and said, hey, this works. And threw it out there as open source. And, eventually people kind of got a hold of it. And the community is kind of taking it in their own direction. So like things will happen like the hurricane that hit, North Carolina and Tennessee. And we got some reports back. Like there was one group that they all had Meshtastic radios. And so they came and they told us like everything else was down, and we were able to use these to stay in contact. And that was really, really helpful. So people use it for things like that. I've got a Meshtastic radio with the GPS built into it on my van that I drive around for work. And the system's not working right now because I'm a tinkerer and I'm always messing with stuff. But when it works, it will broadcast locations back. And so it's kind of a replacement for Google Maps and the timeline on Google Maps so that I can track what I do for work around town. All kinds of fun stuff like that.
Well, when we deal with like radio, how obviously different countries handle what you can do with radio signals a bit differently. I don't know, like obviously there's like tons of countries you can approach this from, but are there any places where like this just basically is not even allowed to be done in that country?
I think we have, so almost every country have what they call ISR bands, which that stands for industrial and scientific radio, maybe. Don't quote me on that. But they have these bands that are essentially, it's unlicensed, right? So you don't have to be a ham to operate it. You don't have to pay for a license. And so it's kind of like here in the United States, you have CB radio. It's kind of the same idea as CB, except it's even less regulated than that. So we run on those. In the United States, it's 915. In Europe, it's like 868 megahertz. It's all going to be right around there. But there's a band plan for most countries. There may be a few places where there's not one yet, or we don't have it added yet. But almost every country has some unregulated band that LoRa can run in.
Okay. Because that's obviously like, I'm sure the government wouldn't be super happy about like, you're getting into bands that they use for other things.
So we internally to the project, we over the past few days have been having a conversation about this because in Europe, in their wisdom, regulators said, you can use this bandwidth, but to keep it fair for everyone, one device can't use any more than 10% of the available airtime. And so the way that we track that is so when you send a message out the radio, you get back, like the library we use, you get back, this is the amount of milliseconds that took to transmit. And so we will track it for an hour. And when you hit the number of milliseconds that represents 10% of that hour, you don't get to transmit anymore until that hour elapses. And that's to follow that regulation, which is fine for a mobile handset. But if you put one of these up as like a repeater, you run out of that 10% really, really fast. And so like I'll just be very vague about this, right? Okay, there are ways that you can go in and sort of work around that issue, and it's of questionable legality. And so I was talking to the other developers. I'm like, if we did this in the United States, the FCC would come after us. And I know that because I watched the FCC come after OpenWRT back a few years ago, and that was not fun. So we really need to think about this. And my European counterparts was like, it's okay, it's a little different here. What we're doing is, it's technically within the law, so we're fine.
Right.
All right, fine. So, but like we have those conversations because you don't, at least in the United States, you do not want to be on the wrong side of the FCC. They do not have a whole lot of they have no time for shenanigans.
Yes, a few organizations in the US I wouldn't want to mess with. That and the IRS. Yes. Stay on the good side of both of those.
If you have the right CPA and you know what you're doing, you can actually mess with the IRS. I've got a client that's a CPA.
This is not legal advice, by the way.
Well, no, it is, because the legal advice is go get someone that is licensed to do this and let them represent you.
Okay, fair enough.
But he has stories about the IRS coming after people, and you may not know this. In the United States, if the IRS comes after you, you can go to court, and you go to a state court, and you can present your case before the judge. And most of those judges actually are not huge fans of the IRS. So if you have a competent CPA that has not outright cheated on your behalf, and you can present a reasonable case, you can actually do quite well against the IRS in this country. But again, it all boils down to having someone that knows what they're doing.
Right. Yeah, that's the way.
That was a tangent. That was a weird tangent to go on, but here we are.
Okay, so I guess you also wanted to talk about the whole Meshtastic solutions thing.
Yeah. Okay. So let's do it. Let me cover a little bit more background about how I got into all of this. Right. So somebody from it was the Untitled Linux Show. One of our listeners on the Untitled Linux Show lives in another country, and they were having some very large mass protests. And one of the things that was happening was their cell phones would stop working during these protests. And so this listener came to me and said, hey, do you know of some piece of software that lets you mesh with your cell phones? I'm like, oh, that's a really cool idea. And so I went looking for it, and I found Meshtastic. And it's not exactly what the listener was looking for, but I got hooked. I thought it was the coolest thing. And so I bought a couple of the radios. I knew I was going to write it up for Hackaday. I eventually had them. I've had them a couple times now on Floss Weekly. We've talked about it. But I got hooked, and I started looking at the code base too. And I don't remember what my first contribution was. I found something, like there was something that was not quite right. Maybe it was GPS code. The GPS code was something that I worked on real early. So like there was an error in the code base where somebody had done like a whole lot of work to program the GPS in a certain way, and then made a mistake on an if statement, and so like the entire block was unreachable. So I found that and fixed that, and we did some other stuff. Anyway, I started doing development on Meshtastic, and then one of the things that really has kind of become my niche is running. Big surprise here, running Meshtastic on native Linux. And I discovered that the Raspberry Pi has, and we didn't even talk about this. Boy, I love the Raspberry Pi for a couple of different reasons. But one of the reasons I really like the Raspberry Pi is it's got exposed pins. GPIO. When I was younger, that was the thing I was all about, was those GPIOs on the Raspberry Pi, because that lets you interact with the world from inside your computer. That is all. I've always found that cool. But it's also got SPI, and these I don't even know what SPI stands for, to be honest with you. The single packet interface or something or other. But anyway, this is exposed, and these little LoRa radios, that's actually what they talk. And there was this partial project inside of Meshtastic to run Meshtastic on native Linux, but it only ran it simulator. And so I kind of rolled up my sleeves and dived in there, and it's like, I wonder if we can get this thing to talk to the real hardware on native Linux. In a couple of weeks, I figured out a way to do it. And so, I've become the Linux guy over at the Meshtastic project now. And so, we've now got support for a couple of different Raspberry Pi hats. And then later I went in, I was looking at a really old pull request where someone was like, hey, there's this way that we can do public key crypto. And it kind of brought it on the vine, and I went and looked at it. Like, this is actually a cool idea. It's been a couple of years now. So I re-implemented that, and that's been the big thing for Meshtastic 2.5. It fixed some big problems in the code base. Well, so they anointed me, as you will, with the title of lead. I am now the lead of native Linux development inside of Meshtastic. Well, part of this process where they were anointing people as leads is the guy that runs it. MC Hamster is his Discord name. That is how I will forever know him. But JM is actually his name. He kind of was getting sick of all of these companies making Meshtastic hardware and then just expecting the Meshtastic devs to develop it for free. And so they've kind of been working on this idea of, well, is there some way that we can make a company out of this and make a little bit of money? And so when they invited me to be one of the leads, one of the other things that they did, they say, hey, we're working on Meshtastic solutions. Do you want to be involved with it? And I kind of got a look at what they were wanting to do and said, yeah, I think that would be really great. And so the idea of Meshtastic solutions, all of that to get to this, is it makes sense. For one thing, it makes sense for the manufacturers that are making these devices and making a lot of money off of it to have a way to give back to the open source project. But on top of that, we also see these manufacturers making like really not the greatest decisions. Sometimes their decision matrix is a little bit suspect.
I see.
And you'll have things like I've got one device here. Here it is. It's the LilyGo T-Deck Pro. This thing is it's great. It's a Meshtastic device. It is amazing. And the first time I picked it up, my thumb hit this button because I was holding it like this. It's the way I held it. It's like how you hold a BlackBerry to look at the screen. I held it like this. The button right under my thumb is the reset button. It's not a great place for that button to be. Or alternatively, it's not a good thing for that button to do. But it's down deep in the hardware. You can't change it. That's one of the sorts of things that we would see. And it's like, it would be nice if maybe there was a company that would review these devices and sort of let manufacturers know when they've done something sort of silly like that before it gets out to everybody's hands. So that's the idea of what Meshtastic Solutions is intending to be. And so there's like 3 or 4 or 5 of these big companies that I say big. They're not big, but they're not like big enterprise companies, but they're reasonably large companies. They design these devices, they make and they sell them, and we're just reaching out to them and saying, hey, we've done a lot of work. It would be nice if you guys could financially support us. And then like on your next device that you go to make, if you'll work with us on the design, we will put our stamp of approval on it and we'll help you market it. And ideally, everybody will win because it'll be better devices for the customers, be a better device that you can make, and we can actually make a little bit of money out of this hobby and help feed our families instead of just working for nothing.
Right.
But that is the idea of it. That is the direction we're trying to go.
I think that sounds really cool.
And so we've had... we have had a little bit of pushback, as one might imagine, because it's an open source project. You're creating a corporation around it. Oh no! And there have been a couple of things that in Meshtastic before I got there were decisions made that were not exactly the decision I would have made. And so like the source code of Meshtastic is under a contributor license agreement, right?
I see.
I have literally asked the people behind it why, and every time I ask them, it's, that's for the patent grant. That's so nobody can sue us over patents. It's like, oh, okay. And I finally went to him. I'm like, the GPL v3 gives that too. And he legitimately did not know that. He's like, I did not know that the GPL v3 had a patent grant in it. So, like, from the horse's mouth, I can tell you, this is a conversation that we had. So people saw that and they were a little nervous about it. One guy on Reddit said something about, this kind of goes down a different rabbit hole, but it's interesting. One guy on Reddit said something about, well, that's the end of privacy for Meshtastic. And he said something about like the next thing you know, they're getting the Rothschilds money and money from the NSA and whatever. And I guess I'm out. And so, like, first off, I am waiting for that first big Rothschild check. It is not cleared yet. You know who you are. I want my money. Obviously, we're not getting paid by the Rothschilds or anybody. will say though, and this is a conversation I've had a couple of different times, and I'm trying to convince my fellow Meshtastic people of this.
Mm-hmm.
There is a kernel of a real concern that he's got there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's things like in the United States, you have things like national security letters
Right.
that I am, just for the record, I'm 100% against. I don't think there is a scenario where, particularly because code is speech, I don't think there's a scenario where a government can force someone to do something, to write code. It is forced speech, and I think that's always wrong. Just like as a bedrock principle, I think that's always wrong. But anyway, so like there is this shadow of a legitimate concern that, if you are a corporation, then there is a lever there for someone like a government to say, it's time to put a backdoor in your encryption.
Mm-hmm.
And so like, I get that that's a legitimate concern. Now, the antidote to that, of course, is we are GPL v3. We will always be GPL v3. And if you ever have any doubt, you go check out the code and you build it yourself and you flash it yourself. And you're done, and if there was anything in there, you don't have it now because you can look at all the code. Like, it's not that complicated of a code base. But that kind of gets into like this whole different subject. And this is something I run into with Hackaday commenters too. It's like there are commenters that will have legitimate points to make. I may not 100% agree with their points, but they will have legitimate points to make. But they're just, for whatever reason, incapable of making the point without pulling in either this weird conspiracy theory stuff to go along with it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you were to say, I'm concerned that now the NSA and the CIA has a lever on these guys, like that to me is a totally legitimate point to make. In a post-Snowden world, that is a legitimate point to make. Mm-hmm. But saying, oh, the Rothschilds got to him, like, you're just a nut job at this point.
Right.
But again, it's the same central concern. And so I kind of don't understand why. How do you not realize, like, how are you smart enough to have this legitimate concern and yet not realize that the way you're expressing it is just totally off the rails?